Finally, in this unit, we turn our attention to Japan. Now, throughout Asian history, Japan has been one of the subordinate states to the supreme power that is China. They develop more uniquely than other East Asian states because of their geography as an island. They can be more selective as to what parts of Chinese culture they adopt. But they are still heavily influenced by China, by Confucian ideals, by Buddhism that comes from the mainland. But their isolation grows over time, and they begin to fall into a position similar to that of the Chinese and the Ottomans, in that they begin to lag behind the rest of the world, especially the West, in terms of modernization, right? So, entering the 19th century, the Japanese government is still ruled by a single family known as the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, the Tokugawa shogunate begins way back in the 15th century. This is a military dictatorship ruling in the place of the emperor. And this goes all the way back to the feudal period in Japan, where the emperor was unable to rein in the local landowning class known as daimios. And in order to bring unity and to end the numerous clan wars within Japan, a military dictatorship is set up under the position of the shogun. And the Tokugawa family takes control of the position of shogun in the 15th century. Now, from the 15th century on, the Tokugawa show themselves to be a very conservative ruling party, right? In the 16th century, after Christian missionaries from Spain and from the Netherlands begin creating disturbances and begin um, fomenting peasant uprisings, the Tokugawa take the very drastic step of expelling all foreigners from the island of Japan. Essentially, they seal off the country to foreign influence, and they execute all Christian missionaries and create martyrs of them. And beginning in the 16th century, only Dutch and Korean merchants are allowed to visit Japan and trade. All other countries are repelled from the borders and are not allowed to engage with the Japanese population or the Japanese government. So the Tokugawa, once they've isolated the country, create a very socially repressive government. They enforce feudalism on all levels. They try to keep the peasant class tied to the land in order to bring about, this kind of Confucian social harmony. And they leave power in the hands of the local lords, the daimios. So even well into the 1800s, the government of Japan remains stuck in this kind of post classical feudalism, similar to what you see in Western Europe before the Crusades, right? So, with this 3 to 4 centuries of isolation, the Japanese people and Japanese industry and the Japanese government are denied access to the achievements of Western technology and Western knowledge. All foreign influence and contact is rejected, and the Japanese begin to fall further and further behind in terms of modernization and industrialization. Now, as imperialism begins to spread in the 19th century, um, Japan becomes more and more of a strategic point of importance, especially for the United States. Like all industrializing countries, the United States is desperate to gain access to China and its market of somewhere around 600 million consumers. And for the United States, Japan makes the perfect outpost and way station on the way to China. However, because of the Tokugawa's policy of isolation, the Americans are rebuked every single time that they try to engage in negotiations with the Japanese. So in 1853, the United States sends a fleet of warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, and these warships enter Japanese waters around the capital of Edo. And under the threat of war, they negotiate one of these unequal treaties, known as the Treaty of Kanagawa. And this opens all Japanese ports to US and foreign trade, specifically the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. Well, once Japan is open to these countries, the other Western industrialized states begin to get in on the act. And pretty soon, all Western states have access to Japan through these series of unequal treaties. Now, similar to what happens in China, this is a huge national embarrassment for the Japanese people, for the national pride of Japan, and especially for the Tokugawa shogunate. They are the ones who have instilled this 3 to 4 centuries of isolation on the Japanese people. And they are the ones who are essentially responsible for the Japanese people falling behind in terms of technology and modernization. So this sparks what's known as the Satcho Rebellion, and samurai and daimyos from the provinces of Satsuma and Chosun violently overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate and the Tokugawa family, and they restore power to the emperor, right? Now, this is socially and politically an enormous step for Japan, right? With the emperor now in power, feudalism and the power of these local warlords, the daimyo, is about to come to an end. And this period in Japanese history becomes known as the Meiji Restoration, right? Power has been restored to the emperor, and the emperor begins to modernize and reform the country based on Western enlightened culture, right? So, what does this look like? Well, first and foremost, there is a huge national drive for modernization, right? The Japanese go crazy for all things Western. Western technology, Western culture, Western literature, Western food, Western styles of dress, all become the rage in Japan. And the state, under the newly restored emperor, is in the driver's seat of industrialization, right? The state is basically taking ownership of certain industries, regulating them, modernizing them, investing in industrial technology, right? Along with that, socially comes a move for public education. Of course, that education system is modeled on Western styles of education. There's also massive democratic reform. A constitution is written. A two-house parliament is created based on the model of Germany. And feudalism throughout the island is systematically dismantled. The landlords and warlords of the daimyo class have their lands seized by the government. The samurai see their privileges and their income dry up. And so they are forced to essentially take on positions as government employees and bureaucrats. The Japanese also aggressively seek out Western styles of modernization. They send their best and brightest students to all of the top universities in Europe. They also aggressively seek out Western experts in every single field and pay massive sums of money to bring them to Japan so that they can help teach industrialization and help modernize the country. And like I said, Western culture in general becomes essentially the new standard of culture in Japan. The old ways of the samurai and feudalistic Japan are shunned and they're seen as barbaric and primitive, and new Western ways of life are adopted. So, what you see here is some examples of the modernization and the westernization of Japanese culture, right? The traditional dress of the samurai is done away with in favor of new Western style military uniforms, again, with boots and long pants and trench coats and overcoats. Within Japanese culture, Western styles of dress become all of the rage. The traditional Japanese styles and cultural traditions, again, are shunned and essentially seen as peasant and backwards in the face of Western ways of living. And what this creates is what we know as the Meiji miracle, right? Within roughly 50 years of Matthew Perry's visit to Japan, the government of Japan is able to completely overhaul Japanese society and hundreds, if not thousands, of years of Japanese tradition. The industries and businesses of Japan completely industrialize themselves. The government and the army become completely modernized in the Western tradition. Um, every single industry is industrialized under government control. And what the government does is once they industrialize an industry, they create these gigantic corporations known as zaibatsu. And these zaibatsu are basically government sponsored monopolies over specific industries: steel, shipbuilding, um, textiles, etc. And the government then takes those zaibatsus and sells them to large, wealthy Japanese families. And these Japanese zaibatsu become the dominant corporations in Japanese history. Toyota, Mitsubishi, Kawasaki. These companies all start in the 19th century as these government initiated monopolies. Now, the outcome of this Meiji miracle is that not only does Japan modernize themselves, but within that same 50-year period, they begin to challenge Western industrialized countries for power and control in East Asia. In 1895, the Japanese go to war against China and win easily. Now, that is not uncommon after the Opium Wars, but even 100 years earlier or prior to this, the Japanese would have never dreamed or imagined taking on the massiveness of the Chinese state, let alone winning and forcing an unequal treaty on them the same way they were forced on the Japanese. In an even further development and an even grander victory, in 1905, the Japanese go to war against Russia and handily defeat the Russian Navy within a period of about 4 months. And this is a really eye opening development in terms of the political power struggle in Asia, because Russia is viewed by many, even though it covers 10 time zones and incorporates huge parts of Asia, Russia is still considered by many around the world as a European country. And the fact that this tiny Asiatic island of these, again, supposedly inferior people is able to take on and dominate the geographically largest state in the world not only opens eyes, but completely shifts the power structure within the Pacific Ocean in favor of Japan. So the Japanese adopt imperialism based on the Western model very, very quickly. They begin to carve out a sphere of influence in China, similar to what the Westerners are doing. They invade their neighbors, Korea and the island of Taiwan, and conquer them as well. And in the process, they create the first modern Asian state. And very, very quickly, they begin to not only challenge European dominance around the world, but they also begin to challenge the racial and ethnic stereotypes and the racial and ethnic beliefs behind imperialism and these ideas of inferiority and racism towards Asian people. Although in some cases, they actually reinforce it because, in the eyes of many in the West, in order for Japan to become a great nation and to even challenge the Western powers, they had to adopt and completely submit to Western culture and Western ways of life, right? So, as the Japanese empire grows and becomes more powerful, and they become the dominant state in Eastern Asia, the Japanese begin to formulate a plan for a massive Asiatic empire free of European influence and free of European interference, with Japan at its head. Essentially, the Japanese begin planning what they call the New Asian Order, which is going to be a massive colonial empire of all of the Asian states run by an Asian state rather than European states. So essentially, within the next several decades, the Japanese plan on not only becoming the most powerful Asian state, but also wiping out the Europeans from the Pacific area as well as from Asia as well. And this is going to be a massive precursor to World War II.